Hello, today we're getting started with Chapter 4, Civil Liberties. Here's a great quote by a very interesting historical figure in American government, Wendell Phillips. If you haven't heard of him, look him up. Alright, so let's get started with the basics. What are civil liberties? So our Constitution in particular contains, those first 10 amendments, which we call the Bill of Rights, which is very essential for protecting our freedoms and liberties as individual citizens. You may remember when we read the Constitution and talked about it in Chapter 2, there's very few kind of assurances to make citizens secure or feel secure in the fact that the government is not going to overstep certain boundaries. So a lot of the states, when they agreed to ratify the Constitution, it was like a conditional ratification. Like, we will sign this, but only if y'all are going to propose a set of amendments which will very quickly be passed to ensure our liberties as citizens. So this week we're going to talk about civil liberties. In Chapter 5, we're going to talk about civil rights. So we use these two words a lot in our society. So I'm just going to lay out some broad definitions for these terms. Civil rights, which we'll get into in Chapter 5, these are guarantees that the government will treat everyone equally, no matter who you are, what your identity. That decisions will always be made based on your merit, not on your skin color, your gender, your sexuality, etc. Civil liberties, on the other hand, which we are focusing in on this week, are limitations on government power intended to protect freedoms that governments cannot legally intrude on. So to put it really succinctly or simply, civil rights ensure that governments act in a specific way toward their citizens, with everyone being treated equally. Civil liberties are boundaries that government cannot or should not cross when it comes to our freedoms. Of course, when I talk today about civil liberties, a lot of our civil liberties are contained in the Bill of Rights. So we do use these words liberties and rights kind of interchangeably. But when we're talking about these terms, though, civil rights versus civil liberties, those are kind of the broad differences. All right, a little furthermore, the idea that we are all born with these natural rights, of course, rights to life, liberty, and property, or as we have it in our Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, are pretty core to the founding of this country and the reason why we even declared independence from Great Britain in the first place. So, as I kind of mentioned a couple slides ago, the Constitution, originally written, did not contain a Bill of Rights. It didn't really even mention, any kind of rights or liberties of citizens to any kind of broad extent. And this made a lot of states and citizens in states a little bit uneasy when they first read the Constitution. They were like, yeah, this form of government that you've laid out here, this framework, it's all fine and good, but what about us? What about all that stuff that we were mad about in the Declaration of Independence and all the grievances that we put forth? None of that is, necessarily being addressed in this Constitution. So there are kind of three exceptions to that rule. The Constitution does have three protections against government overreach within it, found toward the end of Article 1. And those three protections are, number one, it prohibits the passage of bills of attainder, essentially meaning that you cannot just convict, put someone into prison without a trial first having occurred. It also prohibits ex post facto laws, which means the government can't punish someone for a crime that was not a crime at the time they committed it. So let's say, you're drinking a Coca-Cola right now, as you're sitting back with your feet up listening to this lecture. But tomorrow, Congress passes a law and says Coca-Cola is evil. We will never drink Coca-Cola again. It is against the law. It is outlawed across the land. And then let's say your brother is watching you drink a Coke right now, and he calls the FBI tomorrow and says, hey, I saw my sibling, they were drinking a Coke on this day, the day before you passed the Coca-Cola law, and then they come to arrest you. Well, that's illegal, right? You're drinking a Coke today, they make the law tomorrow. They can't punish you for something that you did before the law was passed. All right? And third, it limits the ability of Congress to suspend the writ of habeas corpus, essentially the guarantee that when you go to trial to prove your innocence, that a neutral judge will decide whether you have been lawfully detained. So the neutrality of the judge is also a pretty key facet of our criminal justice system. So during that first Congress of the U.S., James Madison and our founders, they followed through on their promise. They guaranteed the states, hey, if you sign this Constitution, we promise you we will put forth some amendments to ensure the people's civil liberties very, very quickly. And James Madison did go about doing that. I think he actually wrote 19 amendments out. 12 of those passed through Congress, and only 10 of them got ratified by the states, which is why today our Bill of Rights contains those first 10 amendments. So the two amendments that didn't get ratified by the states, the first one had to do with Congress being able to increase its own pay and some limitations on that. That passed about 200 years later with the 27th Amendment. And the second one was an amendment that would limit each congressional district to a population maximum of 50,000 people, which it's probably good that that one did not pass, because I think we have 330 million people, 340 million people in the U.S. right now. If you do the math, that would mean there'd be thousands of people in our Congress, our House of Representatives, and it's hard enough to get anything done with the current 435 that are in there. So probably a good thing that that Second Amendment there did not make the final cut in the long run. All right, so following the Constitution's ratification, the Supreme Court was pretty reluctant to expand the Bill of Rights to curb the power of the states at first. So early on, like pre-Civil War, the courts, the national courts, the Supreme Court, they did not really apply federal law to state or local actions. It's kind of hard from our modern vantage point to even imagine a world where this happened, but for example, let's lay out this important Supreme Court case from 1833, Barron v. Baltimore. That should be italicized. I'm sorry to my law students. But this case, essentially this guy named John Barron, he owned a very profitable wharf in Baltimore Harbor, essentially like an area, a pier, let's say, where boats would come and go, and he would charge them a fee to dock their ships, load, unload cargo, etc. in the harbor. So he owned, that was kind of his business, right? Then Baltimore, this was around the time, we're in industrial revolutionary time period, urbanization. Baltimore is developing into a big city, building factories, building roads, infrastructure, right, to accommodate this growing city. And as usual, with any kind of construction work, there's going to be some debris, sand, dirt, other kind of debris from all of this building and paving and making way. So Baltimore, they were dumping a lot of that construction debris into John Barron's wharf. Oh no! Eventually, there was so much debris building up in this area of the water that the water level started to become more and more shallow because all that debris was building up underneath. Ships couldn't even dock there anymore. So Barron was like, what the heck, Baltimore? You have ruined my business. Ships can't even dock in my wharf. Oh no. So Barron, he sued the city of Baltimore, and he sued it citing his Fifth Amendment right. We'll get to this in a minute here, but in the Fifth Amendment, there's something called the Takings Clause, which essentially says, if the government takes your property or ruins your property, then they need to give you just compensation. They need to pay you some money or make it right with you in some way. So he sued Baltimore, which was a city, right, but cited the federal Constitution, the Fifth Amendment of our Bill of Rights, to justify suing Baltimore. The Supreme Court got all the way up to them, and they dismissed the case because they said, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, those are federal guarantees. They do not apply to states or cities or localities. They only apply to the federal government. So if the federal government had been throwing debris into Barron's wharf at the time, then the Supreme Court would have said, okay, let's hear the case. But they didn't even hear the case because they were like, nope, Constitution, Bill of Rights does not apply in this case because, Baltimore did it, and that's just a city. All right, so early on, pre-Civil War, a lot of this federal, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, any kind of federal laws, they were not interpreted to necessarily apply to states or state actions. This changes greatly after the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which we will talk about in Chapter 5. I'm going to skip over some of these slides here. You're welcome to pause and read them if you want to, but we're going to get into a lot of this in Chapter 5, so I prefer to just focus in on it more deeply in that chapter. All right, so let's focus in on civil liberties, the Bill of Rights, those first 10 amendments for this week. So the Bill of Rights, we're going to kind of categorize each of the, or groups of the amendments into kind of specific labels here. Amendments 1, 2, 3, and 4, we're going to categorize into protections of basic individual freedoms. Amendments 5, 6, 7, 8 are protections for people suspected or accused of crimes. And Amendments 9 and 10 are protections of rights not listed and guarantees of state authority. All right, so this lecture here, we're going to pretty much break down each of these amendments in the Bill of Rights, like almost phrase by phrase. So we are going to start with number 1, the First Amendment, which contains a whole lot in it. The First Amendment is, of course, probably the most famous and the most extensive of the provisions in the Bill of Rights. So Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So now let's break that down. There's a whole lot in that one sentence. All right, so let's start with that first phrase in there. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Stop there. So there are 2 types of religious freedom in our First Amendment. So we're going to start with the first type, which is underlined here on the slide. This is known as the Establishment Clause. So the first type of religious freedom we have is it essentially keeps government from establishing or promoting a specific set of religious beliefs on the people. So Congress cannot create, promote a state-sponsored religion, and it is also not allowed to favor one set of religious beliefs over others. Of course, a lot of like the pilgrims who came over here originally came here, among other things, for religious freedom, right? And at the time, in Great Britain, you had to be like a member of the Church of England, and everything you did, if you wanted to be in government, had to be sanctioned by the church. And so a lot of people who moved over to the New World, quote unquote, new to some, had longings for a government, a society where they could practice their religion, whatever it may be, freely. So one important Supreme Court case, again, this should be italicized, Lemon v. Kurtzman, happened in 1971, and it established kind of a test for the Establishment Clause, which we today call the Lemon Test because of the name of the case, Lemon v. Kurtzman. And this test is used by the courts to decide whether a law or government action has gone too far in promoting a particular religious practice and whether it should be allowed to stand as law. So there's three basic criteria to the Lemon Test. Number one, if an action or law is passed that has something to do with a religion or a religious institution, it must not lead to excessive government entanglement with religion. Number two, the action or law cannot inhibit or advance religious practice. It has to be neutral in its effects. And the action or law must have some secular purpose. So there has to be some non-religious justification for the law. So to kind of put this in action, give you an example, let's imagine I'm in Georgia, so we're going to use Georgia. Imagine the state of Georgia decides to fund a school voucher program that allows children to attend private and parochial schools at public expense. If you don't know what a parochial school is, it means like a religious school, let's say a Catholic school, at the public expense. So the vouchers can only be used to pay for school books and transportation to and from school. So in some states, they might do like a voucher system if to kind of give parents options if they don't want to send their kids to the public school in the district that they live in. The government might provide a voucher system which will kind of like help to partially cover costs of sending their kid to a private or a religious school. However, as this notes here, there are some guidelines due to the Lemon Test of what those vouchers could specifically be used for. So to go through those three aspects of the Lemon Test, education of children, that in and of itself, that's a clear non-religious purpose. So it could be argued that the law has a secular purpose. The law would neither inhibit nor advance religious practice. And since those vouchers, since there's a stipulation that they would only be used to pay for school books and transportation, like busing, then it could be argued that it's unlikely the program would lead to excessive religious entanglement. So, for example, right, just getting on and off a school bus, there's probably nothing necessarily like overtly religious about that, unless your bus driver is like playing like a sermon on the radio every day back and forth. And then for school books, like most school books, yes, there are like religious institutions that publish school books, but say your chemistry school book, it's probably going to be pretty similar to a school book you would find in a public school versus a private school or a parochial school. So it could be argued that providing vouchers for just textbooks and transportation to a Catholic school, let's say, is not going to necessarily lead to excessive religious entanglement. However, if the law was allowing those vouchers to pay for tuition, which would go to a teacher's salary, or to pay for improvements to like the school's buildings or facilities, then you could argue that there's a little bit they've kind of crossed a line into excessive religious entanglement. All right, this second part of our religious freedoms are underlined here. So Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise thereof of religion. So we got you can't establish an official religion, Congress, but you also cannot keep people from exercising their religion to practice. So it protects people from having their own religious beliefs restricted by government authorities, and the government can't suppress religious beliefs or practices. So the Free Exercise Clause has been brought to the courts several times by different religious denominations or practices, and one example of this happened throughout the 30s and the 40s. The Jehovah's Witness kind of brought some cases up through the federal courts that put the Free Exercise Clause to the test. If you don't know anything about Jehovah's Witnesses, to kind of sum it up, they don't really participate in the military. They don't necessarily like pledge allegiance to the flag or salute the American flag, because they view their main loyalty and allegiance should be to their God, right? Not to Jehovah, not to a man-made nation state. And this is where you may know of them if you're not a Jehovah's Witness yourself. They oftentimes do that door-to-door evangelism where they knock on your door and they try to tell you about their religious faith. So what was happening during this time period is children were being punished, expelled, given detentions for refusing to salute the flag, which is part of their religious belief system, right? And others who were taking part in the door-to-door evangelism were being arrested for violating solicitation laws. Classically, solicitation usually applies to like somebody going door-to-door trying to sell you a security system, or selling you a vacuum cleaner or whatever. So the Jehovah's Witnesses brought these cases up through the federal courts and argued like these practices, this is part of our religious belief system. We are expected, Jehovah wants us to go and try to, spread the gospel and his word, right? And at the same time, we don't pledge allegiance to a nation state, to a flag. And so you punishing our children or arresting us for these practices is unconstitutional, and the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Jehovah's Witnesses, using that Free Exercise Clause as justification. Some other instances where the Free Exercise Clause has come into play, especially during like the 80s and the 90s, school prayer, and whether there should be prayer allowed in public schools, and how and when and who is allowed to take part in it was kind of a big issue. And these cases as well kind of bubbled up through the federal court system, utilizing this Free Exercise Clause. So the decision that was kind of concluded is that, let's say you go to a public school and you are the captain of your football team, right? And maybe there's 4 other members of your football team, and you who, you're very religious, you're Christian. And before the football team games, you all, the 5 of you plus your 4 teammates, you would like to, circle up and say a prayer for everyone's safety, etc., before the game begins. Let's say your football coach, goes to the same church as you. So you know he's a Christian too. So the coach could not legally, since the coach is employed by the public school system and public schools are funded by the government, the coach of your football team could not lead that prayer, because that would kind of constitute an establishment of religion at a public facility by a public school employee. But if you, as a student, as a football player, as the captain of the team, if you as a student want to lead a prayer and ask your other teammates to voluntarily join in or not, then it would completely be within your right to do so. Another big issue, getting back to the free exercise clause, is another Supreme Court case from 2014, Hobby Lobby, or Burwell versus Hobby Lobby. And this had to do with the Obama's Affordable Care Act that was passed, which of course it required employees with a certain employers with a certain number of employees to provide employer-based health care to their staff. So Hobby Lobby's founder, David Green, he's a very devout fundamentalist Christian, and he opposes abortion and contraception. That is part of his religious practice and beliefs. And he objected to, there was one stipulation in the ACA which said that employers, as part of those health plans, had to provide free access to emergency contraception. And he claimed, Green, the founder of Hobby Lobby, claimed that this violated his religious liberties, his free exercise, because he did not believe that this was something that was right to do. The Supreme Court went all the way up to them, and they agreed with Green under the free exercise clause that he and any other employee or employer whose religious beliefs conflicted with the provision of free access to contraception or abortion would be completely constitutional. So there was kind of a loophole where if it violated your religious beliefs as an employer, you did not have to provide those specific options in your health care plans. So some religious belief systems have not fared as well in our federal court system. So there have been some exceptions to the free exercise clause made over time. For instance, the Mormon faith, at least historically and very orthodox traditionalist Mormons practice polygamy, or a marriage between more than two people, or specifically a marriage between one husband and multiple wives. It is less prevalent today than, say, in the 1800s, and I know like the official Mormon church has kind of moved away from requiring polygamy or promoting it, but there are still polygamist sects of Mormonism across the country. And the courts have kind of consistently ruled against polygamy, making monogamy kind of the law of the land in the United States. Some other exceptions to the free exercise clause happened in the 90s, early 90s. There was a case, I believe it was in California. There was a Native American employee at a company, and he tested positive for peyote on a drug test, and his employer fired him. And he argued up through the courts that that was unconstitutional, that peyote was part of his religious practice, and that they had unjustly fired him for something that he should have constitutionally had a right to do. The court said, sorry, no dice. They can fire you if they want to. And another religious practice, Santeria, there was a court case also in the early 90s in the city of Hialeah in South Florida. Some practitioners of Santeria, part of their belief system is, Santeria is, they essentially, kind of an offshoot, let's say, of Catholicism, where they worship certain saints, and part of their saint worship is to sacrifice animals to their saints. So this was happening in and around South Miami, and again, a case was brought before the courts, and it was decided, animal sacrifice not going to be protected under the free exercise clause. So our First Amendment also, in addition to our religious liberties, protects our right to freedom of expression, like free speech, press, assembly, and petition. So there have also been some controversies over time over how far our freedom of expression can go, and when and where these freedoms of expression can be limited by the government. So particularly during World War I and World War II, there was some censorship and even prosecution of certain people's political beliefs or protestations, which we into now. So of course you may have heard of kind of the McCarthyism era, like anti-communist, like Red Scare, where there were a lot of state and federal laws that were prosecuting people who were supportive of anything that even seemed to support communism or anarchism. So one important court case having to do with this time period happened during World War I. It's a court case that is referred to as Schenck versus the United States, 1919. And Schenck, this is World War I, there was a draft during World War I, which meant, the government was calling upon young men to go fight in this war, whether they were enlisted or not, or active military or not, I should say. And Schenck, who was a leader of Philadelphia's Socialist Party, printed up some pamphlets. There's a copy of the pamphlet over here on the right for you to peruse at your leisure. But he printed out these pamphlets and started to distribute them to anyone who kind of looked like they were the age of the draft, for men walking up and down the street in Philadelphia. And he argued that the draft violated the 13th Amendment, which we'll talk about in next week's lecture, Chapter 5. But the 13th Amendment, part of it, puts forth our right to not be forced into involuntary servitude. This was the amendment that banned slavery across the country. So he argued that the draft was involuntary servitude, and he claimed that his distribution of these pamphlets was covered within his First Amendment right to freedom of speech. So he was arrested for trying to distribute these pamphlets, and the Supreme Court ruled against him, saying there were limitations to freedom of speech, that he was, by distributing these, he was violating the Espionage Act, which outlawed the obstruction of military recruiting, and as such constituted a clear and present danger to public order. So if you are a clear and present danger to public order with your free speech, then it is not free anymore. It can be censored. Some other cases having to do with our free speech. 1969, Brandenburg v. Ohio. Brandenburg was, unfortunately, a KKK leader, and a local journalist, video journalist, got to know him, and he invited this journalist to come to a KKK meeting, where Brandenburg gave a very long speech, as you might imagine, with a lot of racist undertones, or overtones, I probably should say, and that journalist took video of that meeting and then distributed the video to local news stations. Part of that speech, he went on a rant about the government and so on and so forth. You can Google the full thing, but the quote that I'm going to include here is that he said if the government continued, quote, to suppress the white Caucasian race, there might, underline might, have to be some revengeance taken. So this this case was also brought. Ohio tried to prosecute Brandenburg. Brandenburg said, no, I have freedom of expression, freedom of speech. Got all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And Supreme Court said, well, he did say might. That's why I have it underlined in that quote. He said there might have to be some revengeance taken. And the Supreme Court said, if it was a direct call for imminent, rebellion or lawless action against the government, then maybe we could prosecute this. But he's just kind of putting forth this hypothetical revolution that might have to happen. And since there's nothing imminent about it, that's like, let's go out right now with our, pitchforks and torches, then it is protected under the First Amendment right to free speech and free expression. Supreme Court has also extended the freedom of speech to include symbolic speech. So over time there have been other suits that have come up to the federal court system. For instance, this girl was expelled from her school during kind of the Vietnam War era for wearing a peace armband, like you can see in that upper picture over there on the right. And she argued that was within her freedom of expression. The court agreed with her that you can't arrest someone for wearing something that expresses their political views, even if you don't like it. Raising your fist in the air, that was kind of a symbol of like the Black Panther or Black Power movement, and a lot of people were being prosecuted for that symbolic statement. This was also ruled encompassed within our freedom of speech. And more controversially, the courts have also agreed that you can burn the American flag, and that is covered within your freedom of expression as a facet of symbolic speech. Freedom of the press is yet another component of our First Amendment. Let's look at another key Supreme Court case when it comes to freedom of the press. This is Neer versus Minnesota, 1931. And this is where the Supreme Court ruled that government cannot engage in what they call prior restraint. So the government can't prohibit you from publishing something without a very compelling reason. So backstory, this guy named J. Neer lived in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and he had his own little printing press. He ran his own local newspaper, which he called the Saturday Press, and in it he was also a bit of a racist, and he wrote this whole front page article accusing the local police and law enforcement agencies of conspiring with quote unquote Jewish gangsters. And he called them words that are kind of, hearken to a lot of the words that Hitler was using right around, following up around this time period, comparing, the Jewish population to rodents and vermin. So the state of Minnesota was offended by this, and they tried to block publication of Neer's newspaper going forward, saying it was malicious, scandalous, defamatory. The Supreme Court disagreed. They argued that the government cannot censor or block a publication in advance, except in very limited circumstances. So if the speech was obscene, incited imminent violence, or revealed military secrets, maybe the Ohio government could have restrained his publication. But since they could not prove obscenity, inciting of violence, or revealing military secrets, Neer was allowed to continue publishing his Saturday Press. This ruling was reinforced in 1971 with New York Times versus United States. This had to do with the Pentagon Papers, which Daniel Ellsberg, a government employee, revealed a whole bunch of kind of secret war history when it came to the Vietnam War. There were some stories in there about maybe some false flag operations, that maybe the story that got us into the war in the first place wasn't quite what we believed it to be as the U.S. population. So it's a very controversial kind of publication and expose, and the Nixon administration at the time did not want the New York Times or the Washington Post to publish these previously classified files. However, the Supreme Court sided with the press on this, and they said that publication of those documents could go forward. So there have been some limits to our freedom of expression. For instance, as we noted previously, you cannot incite a criminal act, like an imminent one. You can't say, let's go out right now at 4 p.m. today and, start a revolution. So fighting words, genuine threats are not protected. Supreme Court has allowed laws that ban threatening symbolic speech. So wearing a peace armband, putting your fist in the air, even burning an American flag is allowed. However, you cannot burn a cross, for instance, on the lawn of an African American family's home. That is threatening symbolic speech. There's a long history behind that. Defamation of character, false accusations are not protected, and obscene materials are not protected. And the Supreme Court has defined obscenity as follows. One, whether the average person would find the work excessively lewd, whether the work depicts or describes sexual conduct in a patently offensive way, or whether the work lacks serious artistic, literary, political, or scientific value. There's some issues with this whole obscenity ruling, because even if you look at the breakdown of how the court defines obscenity, there's some room for interpretation in all of these words, right? Who is the average person? Who determines what the average person finds lewd in the first place? What is lewd? What is offensive? What's offensive to me might not be offensive to you, and vice versa. And who is to be the ultimate arbiter of what has artistic, literary, political, or scientific value? But we'll leave that debate for another day. The First Amendment also protects the right to assemble peacefully and the right to petition government officials. So if you remember back in the day when we talked about the Declaration of Independence, one of the many grievances that the colonists had was, particularly in Massachusetts, the colonists were not even allowed to assemble together anymore. They couldn't even meet in public places to discuss their grievances with the English government. So, of course, this was protected in our First Amendment, the right to assemble. We can congregate together, discuss grievances peacefully, and we have the right to petition. We have the right to contact our government officials, to protest, to march, as long, again, as it's peaceful. So these rights also apply to everyone, whether you agree with what they believe in or not. They apply to neo-Nazis. They apply to the Westboro Baptist Church. They apply to everyone. So you have the right to peacefully assemble, but there is also, as usual, there's some limitations. You can't just assemble anywhere. The courts have ruled that while people can peacefully assemble in a public space, not all public property is a public forum. So you cannot go to your local courthouse and just start a spontaneous occupation of the building, or march or protest inside the building. You can't necessarily go to a classroom in a public school and just start a protest. Those are not generally considered what the courts would call a public forum. Other land that has dedicated uses, like if you're going to do a march on like a major highway or block a road, that can also be limited. It might be allowed, but you would have to get a permit from the government days, weeks, who knows, maybe months in advance. Okay, so that brings us to our Second Amendment. The Second Amendment, I'm sure y'all know this one. It's fairly controversial. What does it mean? How far can the government go in regulating our Second Amendment rights, if at all? So we will read it here. A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So before the Civil War, the Second Amendment didn't really cause any controversy because generally every white male in the country was a member of the militia if they were military age, and so they had the right to bear arms. This was not really something that was questioned or regulated. After the Civil War, though, our first kind of institution of gun control measures came into effect under something we call the Black Codes, and this is where a lot of laws and regulations started to be passed, particularly in the South, with kind of the object of disempowering particular groups of people, in particular, black people in our country. So a lot of gun control measures started to ban African American men from carrying and owning weapons. Now, regulations on gun control really kind of ramped up during the 30s with like the mob and mafia scares. They wanted to try and control all of the crime and violence, organized violence that was happening. So a lot of gun control measures started to be passed to try and tamp down on organized crime. The 80s, there was an attempted assassination on Reagan, President Reagan. And so background checks for gun buyers started to be put into effect after that point. And then, of course, in the 90s, really kicking off with the tragic Columbine shooting. And, of course, there have been hundreds more of school shootings or shootings in public places since then. A lot more kind of local, state-level gun control legislation has been passed since then. The Supreme Court has really kind of gone back and forth on their interpretations of the Second Amendment over time. They've been more liberal, allowing of gun regulations and legislation, and they've kind of gone the other way on a seesaw in saying no, you cannot regulate gun ownership whatsoever. So you can kind of see a back and forth here. In 1876, the Supreme Court said that states had the right to limit gun ownership in their states. By 1934, they still kind of held that philosophy. They upheld state bans on sawed-off shotguns. So again, state regulations on the Second Amendment were to an extent allowable. Fast forward to 2008, things started to turn around. The Supreme Court ruled that some gun controls violated individuals' constitutional rights. 2010, state regulations on firearms could be interpreted as unconstitutional. But then, in 2015, the court ruled that San Francisco could implement and enforce strict gun control laws. And then, in 2022, Supreme Court overruled a New York piece of legislation that put a lot of regulations on whether you could concealed carry a weapon. You had to apply for like a special license and prove that you had a special occupation or need for self-defense if you wanted to have a concealed carry license, and the Supreme Court ruled that that went too far, that was unconstitutional. So depending on who's on the court in different periods of time in our history, the court has kind of gone back and forth in terms of the extent to which the Second Amendment can or cannot be limited. Which brings us to Amendment number 3. No soldier shall, in time of peace, be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner prescribed by law. Again, going back to our Declaration of Independence, one of those many grievances that the colonists listed in there was the fact that the British were allowing their soldiers to, again, in particular in Massachusetts and Boston, to kind of occupy vacant houses, vacant rooms in and around Massachusetts. And the colonists were not very happy with just having like British military living right next door to them. So this is why, today when we read the Third Amendment, we're like, what? Why is this in here? But, they were right on the tail end of this actually happening to them, leading up to the American Revolution. So, this is why it's in here, and we will move on to Amendment number 4. The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. So, in other words, the Fourth Amendment is protecting us from kind of overzealous law enforcement efforts, make sure that the police have good reason or probable cause before they intrude on people's lives with criminal investigations, and it guarantees we can expect a certain degree of privacy from government intrusion in our homes. So the Fourth Amendment, the first part in there, it places limits on searches and seizures. So if the government wants to search your home, they have to apply for a warrant. They have to apply to a judge in order to get a legal document signed that says, okay, yes, you can search this person's property and you can seize anything that has to do with the suspected crime. So law enforcement officials, in order to get a warrant signed by a judge, they need to give some sort of like a good reason, we call it probable cause, to believe that a crime has been or will be committed first. Now, again, as usual, the warrant requirement, as many of these liberties, there have been kind of exceptions made, loosenings of, the regulations when it comes to search and seizures. So, one exception that has been made is if a person is outside of their home, if you're walking up and down a public sidewalk, it could be argued that you don't have a reasonable expectation of privacy. So if you remember, New York has kind of moved away from this now, but for a while, New York law enforcement was practicing something called stop and frisk, where if you were just walking up and down the streets or on the subways or whatever, and a law enforcement officer just suspected something of you, suspected you were doing something against the law, they could just stop you and search your person. And this was completely allowable. You were outside your home, you're in public, you didn't have a reasonable expectation of privacy. I know currently law enforcement in New York has moved away from that practice, so just want to note that. Police can also search and seize your home without a warrant if, let's say you're a renter and they contact the owner of the house and ask them, hey, can we go in your house and search the property? Then if the owner says yes, then you don't really have any rights to say no. There's no reasonable expectation that evidence may be destroyed or tampered with. So if they think you have a whole bunch of cocaine in your house, and they think if you get tipped off that they're coming to search it, and you might, flush it all down the toilet, then there might be an exception made to search without a warrant. Or if a law enforcement officer comes up to your house and you've got the window open and the blinds are open and the curtains are pulled back, and they look in at your coffee table and see a cache of weapons and little bags of marijuana and counterfeit money lying all out in plain view, well, law enforcement could technically just go right on in there without a warrant if it's right there for them to see. Now, there is one exception to all this. If law enforcement entered your home and did a search and seizure without a warrant and seized some sort of evidence of your crime or whatever, but they came in without a warrant and they couldn't prove those 3 exceptions we just went over, then whatever they seized, whatever evidence they seized of your crimes or suspected crimes, would be considered invalid. The court would just throw it out under something they call the exclusionary rule, because the law enforcement officer or officers did not have necessarily probable cause and did not apply for a warrant. So now we will turn to our next category, Amendments 5 through 8, which guarantee protection for citizens who are suspected, accused, or convicted of crimes. The Fifth Amendment has quite a bit in it, so let's get started. We'll break it down. No person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury, except in cases arising in the land or naval forces or in the militia, when in actual service in time of war or public danger. Nor shall any person be subject for the same offense to be twice put in jeopardy of life or limb, nor shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. Shout out to Barron v. Baltimore. Okay, let's go through this piece by piece. There's a lot in our Fifth Amendment, similar to the First Amendment. So the first clause in there requires that serious crimes be prosecuted only after an indictment of a grand jury. I'm sure you've heard of a jury before if you've watched Law and Order, but a grand jury is a little different. A grand jury happens before the trial starts. The grand jury actually determines if a trial is even allowable or not. So a grand jury typically consists of like 16 to 23 citizens, and this is usually, it only is required in like big, serious federal cases. Like very serious felonies are going to require a grand jury hearing. You usually don't see this at the state level. And also, as the Fifth Amendment states in there, the military kind of has a whole separate justice system, so this is also kind of excluded. So our armed forces do not get a grand jury proceeding. However, if you are suspected or accused of a very serious felony crime at the federal level, then you are entitled to a grand jury where a group of citizens will come in with the prosecutor, the person who suspects you of a crime, and they're going to lay out all the evidence that they have. This is what I suspect this person of, this is the evidence I have, the reason that I think that they are guilty. And that group of citizens, 16 to 23 people, will commiserate, they'll talk about it, and their duty essentially is to just say whether the prosecutor even has enough evidence for a trial to even begin in the first place. So that is the first little clause in there of the Fifth Amendment. Excuse me. The second clause has to do with something we call double jeopardy. This is a process that subjects a suspect to prosecution twice for the same crime. So you can't be tried for the same crime twice. If you go to this federal circuit court and you are suspected or accused of, let's say, murdering a federal agent, and the court at the circuit court level says, not guilty, it's determined you're not guilty, they can't bring you back to circuit court the next year and put you through the same exact trial for the same exact accused crime. However, they could appeal to like the Supreme Court, because that's a different level of the court system. So you just cannot be prosecuted twice for the same crime at the same level of government. At the same time, let's say the circuit court ruled that you were not guilty, but for your suspected murder of a federal agent, but let's say you and that federal agent were both residents of Georgia. Georgia could prosecute you for murder of another Georgia resident. So that would also be a different level of the court system. That would be a state court versus a federal court. So that would also be allowed. So there again are there's like some stipulations here to the double jeopardy right that we have. Number 3, third little clause of the Fifth Amendment, has to do with your protection against self-incrimination. If you've ever heard the saying, I take the Fifth, this is the phrase of the Fifth Amendment that you are referring to. It's your right to remain silent. So when a police officer pulls you over, they read you your Miranda rights, although they technically don't have to anymore after a recent court ruling, but many of them still do. But your Miranda rights, hopefully you've never been arrested, but if you have, the police officer most likely said, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in the court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you, etc. Do you understand the rights I have just read to you? Do you wish to speak to me? So when you're arrested, you do not have to speak to the officer, even if they're asking you questions. When you go to court, you do not have to testify, and your failure to testify cannot be used against you in a criminal trial. So this is when you talk about taking the Fifth, this is the phrase in the Fifth Amendment that you're referring to. The fourth phrase or aspect of the Fifth Amendment has to do with the Due Process Clause, which forbids the federal government from depriving you of remember this from John Locke, your life, liberty, and property without due process of law. Due process, in short, means that everyone should be treated fairly and impartially by government officials, no matter who you are, what your identity. The process in the criminal justice system should apply equally to everyone. And the last aspect of the Fifth Amendment is called the Takings Clause, which I mentioned previously, way back when we talked about John Barron and his wharf in Baltimore. He, remember, kind of tried to sue Baltimore because of his Fifth Amendment right under the Takings Clause. Of course, he was not successful, but the Takings Clause limits the government's ability to take personal property away from a citizen. So sometimes this is called eminent domain by the government, that let's say you have a house and the government is trying to build an interstate highway, and your house is kind of sitting right in the middle of their plan. They want to knock your house down, pave the road, and put part of the highway over your property. So the takings clause of the Fifth Amendment essentially says the government has the right to do this. They have eminent domain over really any property and any land in the country. However, it is your right as a citizen to be justly compensated for any takings that occur. So if the government says we are bulldozing your house and paving a highway over it, they would have to pay you the value of your house, or maybe a little bit more than that. Or they'd have to buy you a house in the next town over and say, here you go, and maybe even pay a moving company to help you get all your stuff over there. So government can technically take your property, but they would have to compensate you for it. Now for the Sixth Amendment. This one also has a bit in it. In all criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury of the state and district wherein the crime shall have been committed, which district shall have been previously ascertained by law, and to be informed of the nature and cause of the accusation, to be confronted with the witnesses against him, to have compulsory process for obtaining witnesses in his favor, and to have the assistance of counsel for his defense. So we'll start with the first phrase in here of the Sixth Amendment. Guarantees the right to have a speedy public trial by an impartial jury in the same state and district where the crime was committed. So there's really three aspects to this liberty right here. First off, you have a right to a speedy public trial. You cannot just be detained indefinitely for 5 years, 10 years before your trial happens. If you're going to be put into jail, your trial should be fairly quickly forthcoming. As well, you are entitled to an impartial jury, right? The government can't just like pick and choose a jury that they know is going to determine that you are guilty. And you are also entitled to have your trial in kind of locally, so that it is a jury truly of your peers, as local as possible. So there are, of course, some exceptions to all of these things. Your right to a public trial there might be an exception made if, let's say, the defendant's right to a fair trial might be undermined if it's public, if the witnesses fear retaliation, or if the trial involves classified information, it may be held more privately, or some things might be held classified from the public. Defendants can request a change of venue if they think that local publicity about the trial might impede the fairness of it or the impartiality of a jury. And some people decline their right to a jury trial and instead agree to a plea bargain, which are pretty prevalent today, in which you just plead guilty to a charge in exchange for a more lenient punishment. You kind of bypass the whole jury trial altogether. The second part of the Sixth Amendment guarantees the right of those accused of crimes to present witnesses in their own defense, if necessary, compelling them to testify. So even if the witness you want doesn't want to testify, they don't really have a choice. And to confront and cross-examine witnesses presented by the prosecution. So if you've seen a court show, or if you've ever been to a jury trial or been on jury duty, you know all of this. Both the defendant and the prosecutors can bring in witnesses to kind of undergird their position in the case. But both sides, let's say a prosecutor brings in a witness, the prosecutor gets to question that witness, and the defendant also gets to question that witness as well, to cross-examine them. Part 3 of the Sixth Amendment has to do with our right, if we are accused of a crime, we have the right to have an attorney in our defense, or a public defender, as we now call it. Because lawyers, they know the law way better than a lot of us just everyday people going about our jobs and family lives, etc. We don't know every single ordinance. We don't know all of the history of our state courts or our local courts or the Supreme Court. So this is why it's helpful to have a lawyer or an attorney who can know all of this stuff and help us out in our case with all of the knowledge that they possess. So this liberty of the right to an attorney was put to the test in 1963 with the Supreme Court case Gideon versus Wainwright. This guy over here on the right, Clarence Gideon, he was a homeless person living in poverty, and one night he was accused of breaking in and stealing money and property from kind of a bar, a pool hall in Panama City, Florida. However, during that court case in Florida, he was never provided with a lawyer. He was too poor to afford one for himself, and so he essentially had to defend himself in this case against like a government prosecutor, and it was kind of stacked against him, and he was convicted to a 5-year prison term. So from his, prison cell, he wrote to the Supreme Court saying, please, can we please appeal my case? I didn't even have an attorney, and isn't that part of my Sixth Amendment, liberties, that I should have an attorney in my defense? So the Supreme Court heard Gideon's case. They ruled in his favor unanimously and said that his Sixth Amendment rights had been violated, that anyone accused of a serious crime was entitled to the assistance of a lawyer even if they could not afford one. So this is the point in time where it's now required that if you have someone who's suspected of a crime and they're going to go to trial, if they cannot afford a lawyer or an attorney of their own, the government will provide one for them. So we know this today as a public defender. Now we'll turn to the Seventh Amendment. Not as exciting as the other ones we've gone over, but in suits at common law, where the value in controversy shall exceed $20, the right of trial by jury shall be preserved, and no fact tried by a jury shall be otherwise re-examined in any court of the United States than according to the rules of common law. So this amendment in particular is not talking about criminal, serious felony cases. If you've ever stayed home sick from school, you might, like me, I would stay home and turn on the TV and there'd be Judge Judy or Judge Millian or all these little judge shows that they show on TV, or I know some of them are on like Netflix now or Hulu. But those shows, if you watch them, they're usually cases about contract disputes, civil law cases, maybe divorce, settlement cases, disputes between a landlord and a renter, contract breaches. So those kind of cases are what the Seventh Amendment is dealing with here. And they say any kind of common law or civil case that is dealing with an excess of $20, which in today's, if you do an inflation calculator, that comes up to a little over $750 in today's money. Then you have the right to a trial by jury, although you can waive that right. If you've ever seen those Judge Judy shows, you know there's no jury there. So you can waive your right to a jury, but if you really wanted one, it is within your Seventh Amendment right to have one. And another part of the Seventh Amendment is the distinction between what a judge and a jury, what their role is. So Judges are only allowed to make decisions regarding law. Juries are allowed to make decisions regarding facts of the case. So if a jury decides that you are guilty, a judge cannot reconsider a jury's verdict. The judge can only take the jury's verdict of guilty and then decide what the penalty will be, what the sentence will be. Will it be a fine? Will it be prison time? Etc. So that's kind of the second part of the Seventh Amendment, says that you cannot kind of like question a jury's ruling. The Eighth Amendment, short but very important. Excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. So there's essentially three very important clauses of this amendment. 1, excessive bail shall not be imposed. So bail, if you don't know, refers to a payment of money that allows a person accused of a crime to be freed until their trial date. So let's say you're accused of a crime, they bring you in, they take your picture, do the paperwork, they schedule your trial for 3 months away. If you are suspected of a crime that's not like incredibly serious, if they aren't scared that you're going to flee to Canada or Mexico or on your yacht and go sail away, then they will offer you bail. So you'll pay a certain amount of money to the court, essentially as like an assurance that, yes, please let me go home for 3 months and I promise I'll come back for my trial. And if you, once the trial is over, you get your money back, as long as you show up for all your court dates. If you can't afford bail, then you can go to a bail bondsman. I'm sure all of you have probably seen bail bonds places up and down the roads of America. Or if you're older like me, maybe you used to watch Dog the Bounty Hunter, which also has to do with this whole bond system, bail and bond system. But getting off topic here, back to kind of whether our bail system in the U.S. is reasonable or not at the moment, whether it's excessive. Little point in fact, our median bail across the country in the United States right now is currently about $10,000. The majority of people who end up in our criminal justice system are at or below the poverty level, very, very low income. And for many people who end up in our criminal justice system, $10,000 represents more than 8 months of pay for them. So whether you think that's excessive or not, I will leave to you to ponder about. Another aspect of the Eighth Amendment is that if you are convicted of a crime and the judge sets a penalty for you, the fine cannot be excessive. It cannot be so grossly excessive that it forces a person to sell all or most of their property to pay it, or grossly disproportional to the gravity of the crime in question. So there was a recent Supreme Court case actually that put this aspect of the Eighth Amendment to the test. 2019 case, Timms versus Indiana. This is Mr. Timms over here on the right. So what happened was Timms was arrested in Indiana. He had sold $400 worth of heroin to an undercover police officer in 2013. He was convicted. He was sentenced to 1 year home confinement, 5 years probation, and that was all fine and good. Like he didn't have a problem with that, part of his sentence. However, on top of that, the state also seized his $42,000 Land Rover, which you can see behind him there in the picture. So he argued and brought it to the Supreme Court eventually that, his crime, which he was guilty of, he was convicted for it, he served the time for it, he had sold $400 worth of heroin. Nobody's saying that's good, right? However, he argued that seizing a $42,000 Land Rover was a bit of an excessive crime in proportion to, or excessive penalty, or fine, in proportion to his crime of selling $400 worth of heroin. And the Supreme Court did eventually agree with him. They said, yeah, this is kind of an out of whack penalty to take this, $42,000 vehicle. He also served time on top of that fine of the vehicle. So the Supreme Court actually ruled that Indiana had to return his vehicle to him. And there he is, victorious due to his Eighth Amendment rights. And the last phrase in our Eighth Amendment has to do with a ban of cruel and unusual punishments. So certain forms of execution in our country have been outlawed and prohibited. For example, drawing and quartering, which is pretty brutal, burning people alive. Luckily, ever since the Salem witch trials, it's not really practiced anymore. But there are also some controversial practices that continue today in our country. Lots of states still have the death penalty. In the states that allow the death penalty, there's lethal injections. And there's 5 states today that actually still allow for firing squads. Mississippi, Utah, Idaho, Oklahoma, and South Carolina are those 5 states. So the Supreme Court has issued several rulings that limit the application of the death penalty. So there are some limitations on it. If you are a defendant with a mental disability, you cannot be executed. If you were a juvenile, if you were under 18 at the time you committed a crime, you cannot be executed. You can be sentenced to life in prison, but you cannot be subject to the death penalty. Typically, the death penalty is not applied to someone unless they have murdered someone themselves or multiple people. So oftentimes you might see serial killers get the death penalty, or someone who committed a very brutal murder of another person. Even so, a lot of countries around the world have banned capital punishment or the death penalty, particularly, all of Europe, Argentina, Australia, Brazil, Mexico, etc. have all completely abolished the death penalty. However, we still, as a nation, at the federal level, it is still allowed. On the next slide, I'll show you not every state practices it, though. So here you can see kind of a map of the U.S. At the time that I'm filming this video, at least. These are as of 2023, the legislation that's been passed concerning the death penalty. There are, as of 2023, 23 states and Washington, D.C. have abolished the death penalty. There are also several states which haven't necessarily abolished it, but the governor who is in power at the time has put a pause on executions via their executive action powers. And all of the red states on the map here still have the death penalty as a, I wouldn't say a common practice. It's not really common, but it is still allowable. All right, and this brings us to our final 2 amendments in the Bill of Rights, 9 and 10, and these have to do with kind of how the Bill of Rights should be interpreted and the reserved powers of the states. So the 9th Amendment here, the enumeration in this Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. This is essentially saying, if you are interpreting the Constitution, and read those first 8 amendments that we just went over, where lots of liberties are very specifically written out, this is not to be interpreted as an exhaustive list. So just because something's not in those first 8 amendments or not in the original Constitution as it was written, does not mean that the people don't retain certain rights if they have not been explicitly, banned elsewhere. For example, nowhere in the Constitution or the Bill of Rights does it say we have the right to marry other people. Nowhere does it give us a right to privacy. Nowhere does it give us the right to employment or education or the right to have a family. However, right, we kind of assume that we have the right to do these things. Amendment 10 has to do with state powers. So the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So this focuses on state powers again. The federal government has all of those enumerated and implied powers, which we talked about earlier in chapter 2. But where the federal government does not or chooses not to exercise its power, the states have free rein to exercise any of the residual or reserved powers. And in many cases, states can go further than the federal government in guaranteeing rights and liberties for its citizens. For example, there are several state constitutions that do, in fact, explicitly guarantee a right to free education for their citizens. There's 18 states, I think including Georgia, that include the right to hunt or fish in its state constitution. Some states explicitly guarantee equal rights for men and women, and some guarantee a right to privacy. Now, you may have noticed throughout this PowerPoint, this word privacy has kind of been mentioned here and there. So a lot of us as U.S. citizens, we assume that we have a right to privacy. However, that word privacy is nowhere in the Constitution. It's nowhere in the Bill of Rights. However, a lot of scholars and even court cases have interpreted our federal laws to imply that we have a common law right to privacy, a right to be free of government intrusion into our lives, particularly when we are in our homes. So some of the amendments we've looked at have been used as justification for this right to privacy. The Second Amendment, you can interpret it to mean that we have the right to defend our homes. The Third Amendment could be interpreted to say, it says that soldiers can't occupy your house. So that implies there's a degree of privacy when you're in your home. The Fourth Amendment sets a high legal standard for a government official to enter your home, to get a warrant, to search and seize your property. The Fifth Amendment sets a high legal standard for taking someone's home or property, that takings clause. And as we just read in the Ninth Amendment, you could interpret that right to privacy as one of these unlisted rights that the people are still entitled to, even if it wasn't explicitly written out anywhere. And today, kind of this right to privacy comes up a lot, especially, starting in the early 2000s. There's been a lot of, advancement in technology and artificial intelligence, in our cell phones and drones that have brought this kind of issue of, do we have a right to privacy, and to what extent does that right go? So a lot of kind of surveillance monitoring has been instituted across our country in recent decades. Police cars, police officers are equipped with cameras, roadways, your traffic lights have cameras on them. There are drones that kind of hover over us, depending on where you are, surveilling the populace for different reasons. Our tollways these days kind of are electronic. You don't even have to stop at a poll booth and physically pay money anymore. They just take a picture or scan your car as you're going by. Pedestrians in large cities are monitored by cameras with facial recognition. Cell phones, of course, are constantly reporting out your location to the nearest cell phone tower. Lots of apps are just tracking your search history, your purchase history. Alexa is listening to you. And of course, a lot of social media profiles today are being used to help build artificial intelligence for a lot of major media companies and tech companies. Law enforcement has the right in many ways to remotely activate your microphone or your camera on your phone or laptop, etc. So there are a lot of issues coming up, especially in the past couple of decades and a half, that have brought this issue of, do we have a right to privacy or not in our country to light. A lot of this started, as I mentioned, in the early 2000s, particularly leading up after the 9/11 attacks, with something that Congress passed that was called the USA Patriot Act, which stood for Uniting and Strengthening America by Providing Appropriate Tools Required to Intercept and Obstruct Terrorism Act. So, of course, it was passed with good reason. We're following up after 9/11, a lot of fears of continued attacks against the American people. Of course, there was a backlash. Advocates of civil liberties who said we have this right to privacy argued that it was making it too easy for government officials to seek and obtain search warrants, to bypass warrants. And it actually was found over time, though the Patriot Act did maybe find some, legitimate criminals or terrorists, it was also being used to prosecute kind of drug dealers and U.S. citizens who didn't really have nefarious, let's say, plans against the U.S. government in mind. The Patriot Act expired in 2015, but there was a new bill passed with kind of a lot of the same stipulations, the USA Freedom Act, and as of more recently, there's another act, FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, that also has expanded surveillance powers of the federal government. So these kinds of issues of this right to privacy that a lot of us assume we have seem to be kind of ever present recently in our modern lives, and with the fast development of AI, I don't think that these issues are going to be going away anytime soon. All right, well, this is pretty much my conclusion slide here. Just getting you kind of thinking about this right to privacy, what you think about it. Do we have a right to privacy, and to what extent, and what do all these technologies, how do they play into this right if we have it? For instance, when I was talking about AI and apps tracking you and whatnot, a lot of that across Europe there's been legislation put in place that bans companies from doing a lot of these things, like tracking you and using your social media account to build AI. But the Congress in the US, as of the time that I'm filming this, has yet to really put any legislation or pass any legislation having to do with these issues of our privacy and tech and AI and tracking and all of this. All right, this concludes my little presentation on our civil liberties, the Bill of Rights, very important kind of addendum to the Constitution as originally written, which protects us to a certain extent, of course, with lots of exceptions and gray areas here and there, but does protect us and sets limitations on how far the government can kind of intrude on our rights as citizens of this country. All right, I will see y'all, I presume, for the next lecture. We'll talk about Chapter 5 and the topic of civil rights next time. All right, hope you're having a great day, and we will see you around. Adios.